Hello, I'm Daniel Herbert, the managing editor of Boxing News, and this is Flashback, where we take a look back at an issue from the past in Boxing News. This week it's May 31st, 1963. The front page is actually a preview. It's mentioning that Harold Johnson would defend his world cruiserweight crown against Willie Pastrana at the weekend. Now, in those days, the term cruiserweight is what we now call light heavyweight. Both terms are used to describe the division of 175 pounds. Now, of course, cruiserweight is a separate division, but in those days, cruiser and light heavy were the same thing. I had a picture of Harold Johnson, the champion, after he retained his title against Gustav Scholz in Berlin in 1962. I had an inset picture of Willie Pastrana, who was the challenger. The fight was going to take place in Las Vegas the following day. That's June the 1st. And we didn't actually make a prediction of the result, but we said that Johnson and Pastrana were both well known as classy boxers, so it should prove a classic encounter. As it turned out, Pastrana would win the fight on points. If we turn inside, the whole one-page feature on the champion, Harold Johnson, on page 5. And interesting, what they're saying is that Johnson's long-term plan was to challenge Sonny Liston for the world heavyweight title. That seems rather strange, because Liston was a big heavyweight and a massive puncher. He was knocking everybody out left, right and centre. Johnson was a career light heavyweight. And as we said in this feature, if the fight did come off, Johnson would have to be giving a lot of weight to Liston. So it seemed a very strange match to even talk about, and as it turned out, it never happened, just as well, because Liston would surely have destroyed Johnson. As I say, the fight never happened because Pastrana would beat Johnson on points, and that was the end of Johnson's career at the top level. Talking about Johnson's career, there's an interesting incident. Back in 1955, when he took on a Cuban trial horse named Julio Medeiros. He'd already beaten Medeiros a few years earlier in Miami. They met again in a nothing special fight, and Medeiros battered Johnson for a second round stoppage, and we said that Johnson gave a pathetic exhibition. It's all very strange. Johnson later explained that he'd been given a poisoned orange before the fight by somebody he didn't know, and this had made him feel very sleepy. And what happened was that the Pennsylvania State Boxing Commission investigated the fight and what had happened, and they suspended Johnson for 6 months and fined him $4,113. And when Johnson then came back and eventually went on to win the light heavyweight title once Archie Moore had retired, became the champion. It was a good champion, was a good fighter, but it wasn't a huge attraction. And eventually he'd lose to Pastrana, and so one of those fighters, Johnson, who was good without ever being great, without ever being one of the great fighters of ring history, but true boxing fans knew he was a good fighter. This is a time when there were lots of good fighters, but often it depended on who your connections were, who your manager was. And also, as the Medeiros incident sort of hinted at, really, without really explaining, it was a time when the mob, the mafia, was sort of involved in boxing, and sometimes you couldn't really trust all the results. Sometimes fighters would throw a fight, and that would earn them a chance at a mob-controlled fighter. So not every fight could be judged on face value. Sometimes fighters were trying their best, sometimes they weren't. You couldn't really be sure. And that Medeiros incident was a very strange one in the career of Harold Johnson, but he was a good fighter, as he went on to prove by winning the title. Then Pastrana was also a very good fighter, and he proved by taking the title off Johnson. Pastrana would go on to retain in Britain against Terry Downs, the former world middleweight champion. That would be in '64, I think. Then Pastrana would lose the title in '65, and he was a very good fighter, but Pastrana was a light heavyweight, really, but who often boxed in heavyweights simply to make money. That's where the big paydays were, but really Willie was a light heavyweight when he trained down to his best weight, as was Johnson. And just have to be grateful that Johnson never actually got to fight Sonny Liston, who would have absolutely destroyed him. Good thing it never happened. And that was Flashback for May 31st, 1963.